Hello, I'm Jyotika. Welcome to Excelling Psychology. This is the first class for AS Psychology, that is for Cambridge CIE 11th grade Psychology. In this lesson, I'm going to be teaching you what independent variables are and how you can identify them. This lesson is very important for both your paper 1 and paper 2. Because for paper 1, for each of your experimental course studies, you have to be able to identify its independent variables. And for paper 2, you have to identify independent variables in research stimuli presented to you. I'll break down this lesson into two parts for your convenience. In part 1, which is this part, I will explain to you what independent variables are. So this is the theory part of it. In part 2, we will practice identifying independent variables in past papers. You can skip this part and move to that one if you're only interested in the practice, but I strongly recommend that you understand this lesson properly so that you have a firm foundation before you start practicing identification. If you want to download the notes that I'm using in this video, you can visit my site alevels.excellingpsychology.com. You can see the link right at the top of your screen right now. I'll link it in the description box as well. There are many more notes on that site. So I have uploaded some model answers there. I have also uploaded notes for your course studies, which will be very useful to you. So in those notes, I have included not only descriptives for the course studies, but also evaluatives. Do visit that site. As of now, I will begin with this lesson and we'll start right where we should, that is with an experiment. Independent variables are part of experiments. So before we get down to what independent variables are, we need to know what an experiment is. Now the syllabus begins with types of experiments. Unless we can identify what the independent variable is in an experiment and how it was measured or manipulated, we will not be able to understand which type of an experiment has been presented to us. So I'm starting in an order which is a little different from the syllabus, but this is the order which must be followed. Otherwise, the lessons will not make sense. Okay, let's begin with what an experiment is. I hope before starting with this class, you are clear that psychology is the science of the human mind and behavior. Now, since it is a science, whatever information is there in psychology about how our mind works and how our behavior works is backed by evidence. By evidence, I mean actual observations of the real world. And how are these actual observations done? They are done through research. So simply saying whatever knowledge we have in psychology is coming from research. You also know that there are different research methods. That is, there are different ways of collecting evidence. One of those ways is the experiment, which we are discussing right now. What is an experiment? You might have this misconception that an experiment is any study that is conducted with beakers and test tubes and scales. Well, that is not the case. An experiment is simply any study which looks into a cause-effect relationship. So regardless of whether it is conducted in the laboratory or in a classroom or in the workplace or at someone's home, as long as it looks into a cause-effect relationship, it will be called an experiment. In other words, the researcher is looking for some cause behind his phenomenon of interest. Let's take a simple example. Supposing you're interested in what influences people's mood. So as a researcher, you're very interested in knowing what could be the reasons behind the good mood of a person or the bad mood of a person. You might believe that eating chocolate puts people in good mood. Now, you could easily think of how you could experiment with this. What you could do is you could have a handful of people eat chocolate and another handful of people not eat chocolate. You could measure the mood of each and you could draw a comparison and you could see which group was in a better mood than another. So there you have it. That's an experiment. Experiments are as simple as that. As long as you are looking into what is the reason behind something or why something is occurring, the kind of study that you're conducting will be called an experiment. So let's be very clear on this, because this is very important towards what we want to understand, which is the independent variable. Now that we know that an experiment looks into a cause-effect relationship, the cause in an experiment is what is called an independent variable. So I just gave you an example of studying the effect of chocolate on mood. We believed in this experiment that eating chocolate causes people to be in good mood, and not eating chocolate keeps them in a neutral mood or maybe a poor mood. What we are assuming here is that people are in good mood because of eating chocolate. Chocolate is the reason for them being in a good mood, and people are in a neutral mood because of not eating chocolate. So not eating chocolate is putting them in a poor mood or maintaining their neutral mood. Whenever we are conducting studies in these terms, in terms of reasons or what is because of what or why something is occurring, we are conducting experiments, and whatever we take as the cause of an effect or consequence or result is what we will call an independent variable in experimental terminology. Similarly, whatever we take as an effect is called a dependent variable. In this lesson, we will not be directly looking into dependent variables. As of now, we are interested in the independent variable. Nevertheless, there is a strong relationship between the IV and DV. So right away we should know that the effect or result or consequence, simply any phenomenon of interest of the experimenter in a study, is called the dependent variable. Let's take some examples of experiments to be clear on what experiments are. Let's say a researcher is investigating the effect of time of the day on a person's hunger. Here what the researcher believes is that a person is hungry, say because it is morning. So because the time of the day is morning, the person is hungry. And say he believes that people are not as hungry in the afternoon. So because it is afternoon, people are not hungry. Another example is that a researcher might be investigating the effect of familiarity with a person on helpfulness. The researcher might believe that why people are sometimes helpful is because a person whom they know is in need, and why sometimes people are not helpful is because the person who needs them is a stranger. So again, it's a question of why or a reason or cause and effect. Another example is if a researcher is investigating method of teaching, what effect it has on exam performance. The researcher believes that, say because of using a discussion method of teaching, students perform better on the examination, and because of using a lecture method of teaching, students don't perform as well on the examination. So the researcher believes that method of teaching is a reason for the kind of exam performance that comes up. All these studies are experiments, and as you can clearly see, not because they are conducted in a laboratory, but because there is some cause or an independent variable that is there in each of these studies, and an effect or the dependent variable that is there in each. Okay, so I hope you're clear with what an experiment is now. Before we move towards the independent variable, just a little more terminology that you should know, because when you write your answers, it is always good to use formal psychological terms. You're a student of psychology now, so you should be able to write your answers in psychological language. The person who conducts an experiment is called an experimenter. In your course, you will sometimes see within experiments the term researcher has been used, and sometimes the term experimenter has been used. Both refer to the same person, simply the person who's conducting or performing an experiment. Now, the people or individuals who take part in an experiment, that is, who perform some tasks for the experimenter, or who are measured by the experimenter, who are assessed by him, they are known as participants. So in every experiment, you will find an experimenter who's conducting the experiment and participants who are being measured or who are performing some task in the experiment. Okay, now let's come towards understanding what independent variables are. Firstly, we should know what variables are. I'm sure by this point, you have come across variables in some science or the other. In my classes, when I ask students to provide me with examples of variables, they typically come up with this example of temperature. I don't know in which science they have come across this example, but this is really fixed in their mind. So you might have also thought of this. Let's take temperature as a variable for now. Why do we call temperature a variable? We call it a variable because it does not remain constant. We know variables are opposites of constants. If temperature took on only one value, say it was always warm everywhere throughout the world, we would call temperature a constant, because then we would say it never fluctuates or it never changes. A variable, however, is something that does fluctuate, that's something that does change. Okay, and definitely it can take on different values. The temperature could be warm, it could be cool, it could be cold, it could be hot. So there are many different values that temperature can take on. That's why it's known as a variable. So let's be clear on what's variable. A variable is anything that changes from time to time, person to person, place to place, and so forth. Let's come to psychological examples of variables now. Which variables do we find in psychology? Before looking at the examples, I want you to know that psychology is full of variables because it is a science of mind and behavior. Both of these, that is human thinking as well as human actions, keep on changing from person to person, time to time, place to place. You will not find the same person performing the same actions all the time. Neither you will find different people thinking in the same way or behaving in the same way. So you will not find constants in psychology. All phenomena of interest to psychological researchers are variables. Okay, now let's look at some of these examples. In psychology, often researchers study time of the day as a variable. Time of the day, as we can see on the screen, could be measured as either day or night. Day and night are two values that the variable time of the day can take on. Now, a variable as such you will find can take on many different values. Which values are included in a particular piece of research depends on exactly what the researcher is trying to study. So one researcher might be interested in time of the day as day and night. Another researcher might be interested in the same variable but different values of it. So he might be interested in time of the day in terms of morning, afternoon, or evening. The variable remains the same, it's just that two different researchers are interested in different values of it. Another commonly studied variable in psychology is familiarity with a person, which we had seen earlier. One researcher might choose to study familiarity only in terms of two of its values, familiar or unfamiliar. Another researcher might want to study it with even more finely bifurcated values. So he might want to study familiarity as little familiarity, some familiarity, or high familiarity. Nevertheless, because it takes on many different values, irrespective of which values are studied, it is a variable. Method of teaching is another variable, and it can take on different values like lecture method, discussion method, audiovisual, which is our presentation method, etc. Okay, so now I hope you're clear with what variables are. They are just something, a variable is just something that could change, and psychology is full of these variables. The type of variable that we are interested in right now is the independent variable. So let's move on to that. Okay, we've already seen right at the beginning when we understood what an experiment is, that an independent variable is a cause in an experiment. Okay, so before we get into its conceptual meaning even further, let's understand its literal meaning. Why is it called independent variable? We just saw what a variable is. What makes a variable independent? A variable is said to be independent when its value is not dependent on the value of any other variable. This is something we understand better when we look at the next lesson, which is about dependent variables, because then we're able to contrast between independent and dependent variables. But as of now, what we can understand is that these variables are said to be independent because they are free. Their value is not tied with the value of any other variable in the experiment. It's not like if some other variable changes its value in an experiment, then the value of this particular variable will change. These variables are free from the influence of other variables. That's why they are called independent. For more understanding, you can wait for lesson 2. Now let's come to the conceptual meaning of an independent variable. An independent variable is simply a variable which has an impact on the dependent variable. Right at the beginning, we saw that researchers are interested in some phenomenon or some variable, which is why they conduct their study. And in an experiment, they want to see why that phenomenon occurs. So this is that variable which they believe affects or influences, it impacts their variable or phenomenon of interest. Okay, so an independent variable, if you're asked to define it, as we'll see ahead, these type of questions do come in paper 1 and paper 2. You should say that an independent variable is that variable in an experiment which brings about a change in the value that the dependent variable takes on. Okay, now let's look at some examples of independent variables. We've seen these examples earlier, but now how we are going to look at them is with the understanding that we have taken right now. Okay, time of the day is an independent variable. Why would I say time of the day is an independent variable? Because it changes how hungry a person is. So it changes the value of the dependent variable or the effect, which is hunger, that a researcher might be interested in studying. Similarly, familiarity with a person is an independent variable. Why is it so? Because a researcher might believe that it influences how helpful a person is. So it brings about a change in the dependent variable of helpfulness. Method of teaching is another independent variable. And why is it? Because it influences how well a person performs in an examination. So it brings about a change in this particular dependent variable. Okay, now something very important. A misconception I have seen students having in my so many years of experience is that they believe only what a researcher manipulates can be an independent variable. Firstly, what do I mean by manipulation? Manipulation means when an experimenter deliberately brings about a change in the value of some variable. Like we saw the example of chocolate earlier. Like if you wanted to experiment with what effect chocolate has on mood, you would administer chocolate to one group of participants and not to another group of participants. You would see what effect it has on mood. Here I would say, if you were to conduct this experiment, that you have manipulated the independent variable. Why is that? Because you as an experimenter are deciding who eats the chocolate and who does not eat the chocolate. So the levels that eating of chocolate is taking on, the ways in which it is being presented is being decided by you. That is very true. In many experiments, we'll find that independent variables are indeed manipulated by the experimenter. But is this necessary? No. Sometimes independent variables could simply be measured by an experimenter. Let's understand this, and this understanding is very important. Some variables simply cannot be manipulated by an experimenter. Either it is impossible to manipulate these variables, or it is unethical to manipulate these variables. Let's consider one example. Supposing the researcher wants to study what impact gender has on intelligence. The researcher might believe that some people are more intelligent because they are boys, or he might believe that some people are more intelligent because they are girls. Can the researcher manipulate someone's gender? Can he decide which gender someone belongs to? Of course not. It sounds ridiculous. All he can do is he can take people who are already boys and who are already girls, give them, each of them, tests of intelligence and compare how well they do on those tests of intelligence. In this case, the researcher simply measures what he believes is the cause of intelligence. He does not manipulate it. Let's take another example. Supposing the researcher wants to study what effect brain damage has on the personality of a person. Can he deliberately damage the brain of some human participants? No, ethics will not allow him to do that. But he does believe that because of brain damage, some people's personality might be affected. So this is an important study that he wants to conduct. How should he go about it? What he can do is, by chance, people who have undergone accidents, he could take them in his study, and he could take some people with normally functioning brains in his study, take tests of both of them on personality and compare whether their personalities are similar or whether the personalities of brain damaged people are indeed affected in some way. If the researcher is simply measuring these variables and he is not manipulating them, why should we call them independent variables? Because independent variables are independent variables not by virtue of manipulation, but by virtue of being the cause of some effects. So please do not be confused with this particular concept. An independent variable is an independent variable regardless of whether it's been manipulated or measured, as long as it is bringing about an effect in the value of the dependent variable. Okay, let's get a little further now into this. I'll just quickly summarize what we've just seen. We've seen that the independent variable is a cause of some effect, and it could be manipulated or measured by the researcher. As long as it brings about a change in the dependent variable, we'll call it an independent variable. Okay, coming to the next topic. Here also something very important that I've noticed from my experience. Students have this tendency before they begin tuition with me to only name independent variables from whatever little understanding they've got in their class. If you just name independent variables when you're asked to identify them in your paper, you're going to be losing marks. Why is that? Because it is mandatory that whenever you identify an independent variable, you have to identify its levels along with that. You're simply not supposed to be naming an independent variable without making a mention of what its levels are. We just saw that variables can change in many different ways. That is, they can take on many different values. So it's definitely of our interest to note exactly which values of a variable a researcher has included in his study. So that's something we cannot ignore. That's good practice, that we should note what have been the levels and we should mention them in the answers that we present. So we have to understand what levels are. Okay, we have just seen that a level we've just seen that I'm sorry, I'm just getting a little distracted. Okay, we've just seen that there are different ways of either manipulating or measuring an independent variable. Like we just took the example of gender. Gender could be measured as either boy or girl. We took the example of chocolate. Chocolate could be manipulated as either eating chocolate or not eating chocolate. Right, and we'd seen many examples previously also. So when it comes to any independent variable, there are different ways in which a researcher could manipulate it or measure it. These ways are what we call levels of the independent variable. Any independent variable, as you can see here, is manipulated, presented or measured in at least two ways. See, a researcher wants to conduct a study. He wants to see what change an independent variable is bringing about in the dependent variable. Of course, he's not going to study only one value of the independent variable. Why is that? Let's take the chocolate eating example again. If you want to study whether people's mood is better once they eat chocolate, you need some reference. You need some comparison to see what their mood normally is. Otherwise, how do you decide whether their mood has become better by eating chocolate? What baseline or what basis for comparison do you have? Nothing. So you have to include another group that's not eating chocolate so that you can see what their mood is. And then you can, by comparison, you'll be able to say, okay, people who've eaten chocolate are having better mood. So it is a requirement, a basic logical requirement that you need another group besides the one that you're directly interested in your study. Or say, for example, you want to prove that boys are more intelligent than girls. You will have to measure the intelligence of girls. Otherwise, how will you say that boys are better? How will you use the comparative terms for boys, which is better, unless you know what the intelligence of girls is? So, though a researcher is interested in only one level of an independent variable, such as the intelligence of boys or the mood of people who eat chocolate, nevertheless, he has to include at least two levels of the independent variable. He won't be able to perform an experiment without that. He won't be able to ascertain that something is the cause of some effect unless he makes a comparison between at least two different conditions in his experiment. We are going to see a lot more about this in our lesson of experimental designs, but as of now, just understand this logically. Okay, so what I've just explained to you, you can see on your screen as well. Why there are at least two ways of presenting or measuring an independent variable is for the sake of establishing a cause-effect relationship, so that the researcher can rule out other possibilities. What if you were to conduct an experiment of what effect chocolate has on mood, and you did not have a group which did not eat chocolate? Then there would be that possibility that the group you've measured, supposing you measured their mood before they ate chocolate and after they ate, the possibility could be that just because of the passage of time their mood has improved, or just because they've participated in your experiment and they felt special or they found it interesting, so their mood has improved. How will you be able to say for sure that only because of eating the chocolate their mood has improved? For that you will need another set of participants who do not eat chocolate, so that you can compare your participants with them. Okay. So, coming back to levels of the independent variable, we have understood why it's necessary to include different levels. What are these levels after all? Okay, so we can simply define them as ways of presenting or measuring an independent variable. Let's look at some examples of these. We've already seen the example of time of the day as an independent variable. We have seen that a researcher could choose to measure it as, say, morning, afternoon or evening. These are three different ways. So this is one way, morning, the second way is afternoon, and the third way is evening. The researcher will just look at his clock and he'll know what time of the day it is. So three different ways he can look at the clock and decide the time of the day. So we'll call these as three levels of the IV. So morning is one level, afternoon is another level, and evening is another level. Another variable, independent variable that we took as an example was familiarity with a person. A researcher could measure how familiar someone is with another person as either familiar, so that is one way of measurement. Another way is unfamiliarity. So familiarity is one level and unfamiliarity is another level. Again, in terms of whether we consider whether this variable could be measured or manipulated, both could be done. A researcher could manipulate this variable. He could get his participants to become familiar with some individuals by making them have a meeting for a few minutes, and he could keep them unfamiliar towards other people by not allowing them to meet. Or he could naturally measure participants' relationships with certain people. So they must be having some friends as it is, and some people must be estranged to them, so they're strangers to them. So he could simply measure how helpful they are towards their existing friends or people they don't know. Or he could make them familiar with some people and keep them unfamiliar to others, and then compare how helpful they are towards each. Regardless of whether he measures or manipulates, it remains an independent variable. Okay, next we have method of teaching. We saw that also as an independent variable. Method of teaching could be presented to participants as either lecture, so that's one way. Discussion is another way. No teaching, that is not teaching participants at all, leaving them to study for themselves, that could be another way. So we'll say that in this experiment there are three levels of the independent variable. Okay, I hope you're clear with what levels of an independent variable are now. To summarize, levels of independent variable are simply the different ways in which a researcher measures an independent variable, or by which he manipulates an independent variable. With this, I end this particular class. I've tried to keep it quick but yet thorough. Of course, it's very important that once you've understood this class, you practice identifying independent variables. Understanding is one thing, practicing is another. You need a different set of skills to be able to actually identify these variables. So that's something we are going to do in part 2. I'll link the part 2 video in the description box below. So see you there.